I love being in the mountains, and I'm like, I'm gonna move to the mountains, make jam. I'm like, I will probably last 2 weeks, and then I'm like, okay, what's next?
I think we get that backhand a lot as human beings. Like we don't get to see the full picture. There's these snippets and then you're just glorified.
The difficulties with people getting permits to renovate their house, to open a small business, all of those things, I mean, have become now priority areas, and we're doing bucket by bucket, like cleaning up the codes.
Self-care is all about just the silence, just to yourself. Maybe like the water, or like the mountains, or doing something much deeper than that.
As I was growing up, like for me, there was no difference between like men and women in the sense of like, oh, well, you're a woman, you can't do these things, or, chivalry was always there.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Today's episode, we had a wonderful guest on, and we talked about the personal life of Mayor Elen Asatryan. I know that everybody is waiting for more of a political conversation, and I tried to have a little bit of questions here and there in reference to everything that's happening in our school system and Glendale in general, Burbank in general, but I really wanted to dive away from that and really make this show about her. I wanted to understand about her upbringing, her morals, her values, what she looks for. It was really interesting because she dived and talked about her purpose. She did talk about her interests. She talked about herself, her self-care. And one thing interesting that I think that we tend to forget as human beings, despite the differences of what side we are on, we tend to forget how lonely sometimes life can get when we're in a higher political position. And I think Mayor Asatryan eloquently explained how she feels at times and the sacrifices that uh, as politicians have to make when they are running or when they are in support of a system. And it was really intriguing and interesting to hear her story, her life, her views, and some politics in there too. So I think you guys are definitely going to enjoy today's episode with Mayor Asadrian. Make sure to support this channel, you guys. It's such support for a new podcaster like myself. So make sure to subscribe, make sure to like, make sure to ring the bell, all of the above, and enjoy this episode with Mayor Elen Asatryan. Ellen John, thank you so much for joining me today. It's such an honor to have you.
A pleasure to be here.
I know. So tell us about your Armenian experience. You went back home. How was that?
It's not the first time. I go
Of
almost
course.
every year. I was obviously born there, and my dad's side of the family is still there. My godparents are still there. But this was actually the first U.S. Armenia local delegation trip organized by the U.S. State Department,
Mm-hmm.
which was huge because it had mayors and executives from different states. So we had folks from like Michigan and Montana and um, I want to say Wyoming. The Deputy State Department was represented. The ambassadors were with us. It was, I mean, uh, I was the only Armenian mayor, which also gave me an opportunity to also give the group different highlights,
Mm-hmm.
right? And things that we need to try. Like, we were in Gyumri for our
Yeah.
local democracy forum, and then we were about to head back, and I was like, but you can't leave Gyumri without having ponchiks in Gyumri. And so,
Oh, yes.
and they were like, what is that? And so we actually, like, because we were a large group. It was like two cars, and I was like, "Well, whoever wants Bonchik, stay in one car, and then the other one can head back to
Oh my God.
Yerevan." But it was a great opportunity, I think, for U.S. elected officials to see Armenia, and I think, this is obviously this is not my first delegation trip. But I also used to organize delegation trips to Armenia. So
Yeah.
being on the other side of it as an elected official was different for me. But I will tell you that one of my favorite parts about landing with a delegation trip is seeing individuals that are not Armenian
Mm.
experience Armenia for the first time. And I think that might also have to do a lot with our messaging and lobbying efforts. where we talk about the Armenian genocide, we talk about Artsakh, we talk about the refugee situation right now, the difficulties, the war, the ongoing genocide, and so
Yes, ongoing.
and
Absolutely.
but as you are talking about those things with elected officials that are not Armenian, what you're also doing is also painting a picture of what a place would be like. So, especially that first day or in Yerevan, like when they land, I think the common theme across the board over the years has been like, I had no idea this it was so metropolitan. Didn't realize it had such a nightlife and amazing
Wow.
restaurants and whatnot, right? So, I think looking at how we are presenting both to elected officials moving forward is really, really important because we also tend to operate in our own bubble, right? Of the things that we are fighting for, but we're also not highlighting all the wonderful things that comes with Armenia and Armenian culture and the Armenian economy and all the opportunities that are available for the rest of the world to actually enjoy.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I actually went back after we had moved in 2013. My first feeling of Armenia as an adult, right, was I compared it to Barcelona, in
Wow.
the sense that, like, for me, it was a reminder of Barcelona because of all the places that I've traveled. It's the only other place aside from Armenia where you will see a 70-year-old with a 5-year-old out at 1 in the morning, right? Like,
This
but
is
that's
so
but that's but
true.
that's so special.
It
That
is
is so
very
special. That
special.
that cross generational
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah.
The idea that a child can be out at that hour for especially Americans is like such a foreign concept,
Yes.
right? But really how family oriented Armenia is. And in many ways, when you look at like the urban planning, and there's so much, as part of the forum, I said, we constantly say, like, how can the US help Armenia or how can others help Armenia? I really do see our sister city relationships and our relationship with Armenia really as a bilateral relationship. There's so much that we can learn from Armenia. There's so much that
Yes.
Armenia has to offer to the rest of the world. And, I'm currently
Truly.
working on, there's a couple of restaurants and bars that are absolutely out of this world that are in Armenia that I'm actually trying to bring to Glendale
Really? Which
right
ones?
now. We're in talks, so I'm hoping I can't.
Okay, you'll tell me later.
I'm not going to disclose it now, but I'm hoping that we can,
Well, Godzin is here. There's
Gotzin is
Godzin in
here, right? And
Armenia.
and
It's
I'll tell
amazing.
you. So with us was
Kara too.
uh,
Karas.
Garas is yes.
Cars, there's
Garas is
all
also
over. Yeah.
yes. The director of urban planning and research from Governor Newsom's office was also on the trip with us, and California and SUNY are sister cities. So when I was going to Kapan, I told Sam to like join us. I'm like,
Yeah.
it'll be a great opportunity, and he absolutely fell in love with Kapan and Sunik and just like the region itself and just
So
Armenia.
beautiful.
He won't stop talking about it. He's Ethiopian, so
Oh,
he's
wow. Oh,
his roots
okay.
are also like he grew up around Armenians and eating Armenian food in Ethiopia. But we were looking at economic development opportunities in Armenia and um, all not just like you look at the IT sector, and I mean Glendale's a perfect example of that because we have, companies like Disco that are headquartered in Glendale, but they also have an office in Armenia,
Oh, my
right? And
goodness.
so, how do you really create that bridge where
Yes.
you're not only giving to Armenia, but there's true like exchange programs? I'm really excited that this morning I visited the Women's Center in
You
Armenia. I'm very
did.
passionate,
Uh-huh.
as you know, about women's issues and domestic violence issues. Um, and they went from having like getting like 50 calls a year to 1,000 a year. Their programs are expanding, and it's not because domestic violence is necessarily on the rise in Armenia. It's just the culture's changing, and women are feeling comfortable enough to
Speaking up more and
yeah, and,
more.
and turning to resources, right? And
Right.
so had our first meeting with the YWC of Glendale and the Women's Center of Armenia this morning, where I brought them together. So they're going to be starting to like exchange uh, different programming, how they build out the shelters and all of that stuff.
That's
And
beautiful. Wow.
they're and then part of that discussion was also because there's a rise in response, there's not really training on behalf of like on the part of the police officers in Armenia to respond to domestic violence calls because they're not trained to do that. Our police officers have a great training program that they have to go through. California is one of the strictest when it comes to domestic violence. So, creating a partnership where our police officers in Glendale are actually doing training with police officers in Armenia specifically on domestic violence response, right? And the beauty of having a diverse workforce here is being able to say, I need an Armenian speaker and preferably somebody that speaks Eastern Armenian to be able to communicate with the officers there, right? Because the
Yes.
uh, th- and coming from that culture, you also understand some of the social norms around it, where you help break down some of the barriers that exist within a
I
community.
love that.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about passions. Like, what other passions do you have? Because we only see, well, not only maybe you portray it, and some people don't see it, but like, what other passions do you have other than being in the political party and having this passion for women's rights? Like, is there anything else that you would want like the audience to know
I'm very
about you?
passionate about equity, and
Yeah,
that that
yeah,
that's and not just like I'm not talking about women
of
only,
course.
right? But I think my experience as an immigrant here,
Why is
um,
that important for you?
uh, you see in many ways. Look, I think whatever we are, we bring to the table.
Hmm.
I'm somebody that loves concerts and art and food and hiking and the outdoors. And I think the more active you are and the more love you have for life, you also get to experience things and you also see where the gaps are. So if I was an individual
Hmm.
that, just went to work but didn't, take into account family or friends or trying to squeeze in, even if it's at 11 o'clock at night to grab a bite to eat with a friend,
Hmm.
then I wouldn't know that we don't have XYZ in our city and it's lacking because for the most part, you're also looking at how you create economic development, which has been like, I'm very big on economic development. I'm proud to say that
Yeah.
for the first time in the history of our city, I initiated for us to have economic development as one of the four priority areas. And then I call it the unsexiest thing because I find it the most important, but it's usually not things that um, the public grasps on. So you'll hear things like housing and you'll hear things like sustainability or economic development as like, you know, priority areas for a
Yeah.
city.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I also introduced was creating efficiencies and efficient systems within our city hall,
Hmm.
which applies across the board to everything, right? And
Mm.
I point to it's the same thing as if you don't have your house in order, you can't service out and you can't
Mm.
have people over. And so for me, when I look at our planning and permitting department, the difficulties with people getting permits to renovate their house, to open a small business,
Yes.
all of those things, I mean, have become now priority areas. And we're doing bucket by bucket, like
Hmm.
cleaning up the
Hmm.
codes,
Hmm.
because a lot of that is just a lot of red tape that's in the books that makes the process more difficult. Even things like, our planning department doesn't have deadlines. Like, so the planners can take as long as
Hmm.
they want to do
They,
something,
yes,
right? But
absolutely.
they're also overloaded. So how do you create a system where you're supporting your workforce? And I think that's where like my business background also comes in. When uh, I've always taken pride in being a support system for my own employees at my small business, and I look at the city as a business as well.
Hmm.
So how am I catering to make sure that I have policies in place and procedures in place that welcome small businesses to come to our city versus go somewhere else? How do we make it easy for somebody to build their dream home, whatever that looks like? And so those
Yes.
are all the things that really impact. And then I'm very nuanced in policy. So I'll
Mm.
give you some examples of um, one of my colleagues had introduced this very hefty plastics ban
Hmm.
that was going to impact all of our restaurants and all of our eateries. the policy or the ordinance would have had things like all uh, takeout items would have to be biodegradable, zero plastics, and then there was something about a 25-cent cup charge if you didn't take your own cup to the restaurant. For me, initially, like the 25-cent was like definitely off the table because um, both like sanitary reasons, right? Like, okay, and then like I'm very practical and things, so I'm like, okay, walk me through it. I walk in to In-N-Out with my 8-ounce cup, and their things is 10, 12, and 16. How much you charging me? Right?
That's
Like,
interesting.
and I think a lot of times, especially nowadays, and I've been complaining about this both on the local level and state level, like there needs to be more thought put into the implementation part of a policy. If we want to say we did it and we put it on the books and it's somehow in the books, but you're not really seeing it through. And so with that policy, actually, none of us own a restaurant or an eatery on the city council. So I started calling some of the restaurant owners that I knew. I said, hey, can you walk me through? I care very much about sustainability. This is really important to me. I want to be supportive of this effort, but walk me through how this is going to affect you. Because I don't know what you use, I don't know what the prices are. And after speaking about 4 or 5 restaurants, first I learned that no one knew this thing was coming to council, which I have a very big issue with. It's going to affect all of our mom and pop shops, but they had no idea that we're voting on something like this. They talked about how there's supply chain issues, that the inflation costs, like a takeout box that was costing them 45 cents, is now costing them like 70 cents, and they can't even get it from the US. Now they've changed vendors because there's a supply chain issue, right? And so the Sunday before the Tuesday meeting it was scheduled for, I kind of went nuts and started going down Brown Boulevard and going into all the restaurants. They thought I was an inspector coming in because council members and
yeah.
stuff don't do stuff like
Yeah.
that. And my goal wasn't to stop it. For me, it was like number one, being educated myself about the policies that I'm making that's going to impact an area that I care about, which is small businesses and how we support them. But also making sure that they were also aware of like the decisions that we're making and that they have a voice. I come from an advocacy background, so for me, like I very much care about the grassroots effort and the true grassroots effort because a lot of times what you'll see, and this is what I really struggle with, even with our community, we tend to complain around barbecues and on social media and dinner tables, but when the moment comes when the vote is happening at the city council meeting, they're nowhere to be found, and this is their city. 40%, roughly 40% of our population in Glendale is Armenian American. About 16%, I believe, is Asian, right? And I want to see that diversity when I look out. And sometimes, some of my colleagues have said like, "Oh, the whole room was like shaking their head at you, and you still voted the other way." And I was like, "It wasn't the whole room. I literally split the room into two. And if you are somebody that's active, you know what the issues are and what people are struggling with, and who is privileged enough to be able to show up to a council meeting, right? So I take all those stories with me. I know that we have permitting issues. I know that people struggle with
Yeah.
housing. That I know that the restaurants are struggling, and so
Let me ask you something. That's a really good, interesting point you brought up. How, and this is just a personal question
right,
because this is what we're gonna make
right,
it today,
right,
right?
right.
It's all about
Yeah, right,
you.
of course.
How do you handle like afterwards, like after work? How do you handle so much? I don't want to call it hate because that's such a harsh word to state, but how do you handle so much like hate, I guess, around the decisions that you make? Because I mean, some people are really against a lot of the things that you work, like the equality that you were talking about, like things that are happening in the schools. Like we understand this politician side, but you as a human being, as a person, like how do you overcome
So
moments like
I'll
that?
give you an example, right?
Yeah.
Like just on the restaurant thing.
Yeah.
So about 60 restaurants showed up to the meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and I told them, I said it's not enough for me because for anything to get passed or stopped, 3 votes. Okay, we're 5 people. You need 3 votes. Unless it's land use, you need 4 votes out of the 5. So I said it's not enough for me to know. You need to also let my colleagues know because I'm only 1 vote.
Yeah.
right? But I'm
Yeah.
I'm also trying to get your voice at the table. So about 60 restaurants showed up. Um, the Chamber of Commerce showed up. They weren't even aware that this thing was coming, and they
Why
all
weren't they
talked about
aware?
their own. They weren't following like what's happening at the like
Oh,
they no, and no one had informed them from the city that
this
this
is the
item.
Chamber of Commerce. Wow.
So so sure enough, about 60 of them showed up, and obviously our local environmental coalition, which I have a great relationship with, also showed up on
Mm-hmm.
the other side of the issue, wanting this. And I said, look, I'm very interested in the impact that we create in this space, but how do we help our small businesses get to that space? Is
Mm-hmm.
what I care about. Um, I'm not okay with making decisions in a darkroom that impact the whole industry and say you go figure out how you're going to deal with that. This is an industry that was just like even when after COVID still has not recovered, right?
Right.
And if I care about economic development, if I care about my small businesses and mom and pop shops, why would I do something that makes it difficult
Mm-hmm.
without helping them? And so I said I'm interested in data driven decision making. So I want what I proposed, and I got colleagues to agree that we halt this whole thing, and we work with our restaurants to find out what is actually available, what's not, and then uh, also look at bulk buying as a city
Mm-hmm.
to see if the costs actually like match up and be able to reduce that, and then for us to come back with something that works for everyone.
Right.
And also like how do if this is important to me as an elected official or as a city, and this is part of my goals, how do I what incentive programs do I create or programs to create that help that whole industry move into that space,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it
Mm-hmm.
was the same thing with like gas leaf blowers. It was like a 4-1 vote. I was the only one that voted against it to ban them. I agree that they're they're awful for your health. They're but to replace those are it's between $10,000 to $15,000.
Mm.
Okay, so just by one vote, what what I'm doing without creating, and I said I will only support this if there's an incentive program that helps gardeners move into this space.
Mm-hmm.
Without it, I won't do it. And how do for me was how do you pass something and put it into effect where then code enforcement can come out and start citing and penalizing people for having a gas leaf blower instead of electric,
Mm-hmm.
and you just put a $10,000-$15,000 burden on a gardener? Like that doesn't, I mean, those are the things that happen on like, every Tuesday we make a lot of decisions at the council that affect our residents, that affect our small businesses, and how you're thoughtful
Mm-hmm.
in creating those policies.
Do those
Uh,
decisions affect you in any way?
in what sense?
For instance, going back to kind of like my
Oh,
original
like how do I
question.
how do I
Yeah,
process?
like how do you
Look,
process?
I think when you know your purpose,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes very easy. Um, I can look out and, after that restaurant ban, for example, the Glendale Environmental Coalition was very upset at me, right?
What did you get from that? Like, what kind of
What do you mean?
like when you said they were upset at you? How do you
Right. So
how do
it's
you
like,
know?
well, is she really for sustainability, right? Like,
Mm,
uh, some folks were about that, then, the colleague that introduced it was upset. Like, I'm just having like very frank conversations on how like politics really works, right? But, when I ran for office, I talked about being a voice for those that really don't have it. And for me, yes, you can be an organized group, and I'm all about bringing different groups together.
mm-hmm.
And that was my solution to it. Okay, Glendale Environmental Coalition, our sustainability chamber and restaurants, you guys get together and see what works,
Mm-hmm.
what we can create to actually leave an impact. And part of that, I also said, look, we want to talk about plastics, man. Your Indian Cafe on brand is not your problem. You know what your problem is? Your schools and hospitals create the largest plastic waste. So, how do I help GUSD, for example, get funding to switch over to reusables at the school sites for kids, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
We used to have that when I was going to school. It wasn't all this plastic stuff. It was, if you remember, it was
Mm-hmm.
like, right? So like how do you if you know if you take care of some of those bigger things, then the burden is not placed on the little guys, right? And so, and there was conversations. Well, they can come and get a waiver. I'm like, I'm trying to like clean up codes here. So the restaurant owner is like, being a restaurant owner is hard. And like
Very,
I have
very.
family members that are
Yeah.
restaurant owners, right? Like they
Oh yeah.
own their
Yeah.
little, that they
Hmm.
like they live and breathe that
Oh yeah. It's a different kind of hustle.
24/7, right?
Hmm.
Now I'm gonna ask my restaurant owner to leave his like business and come fill out a paperwork and say, oh, but this thing that you're asking me to use doesn't exist.
That's
Or it's
interesting.
like, the cost is this much more, so it's gonna affect me and I can't, and so I think again, for me, I'm in that moment, I talk about this a lot, but I got involved in politics at a young age, and my dad gave me, I think, perhaps like the greatest gift. He wasn't too keen on me being in politics because there weren't any women when I got involved. I'll be very like,
Armenian women,
right,
particularly,
well,
right?
I mean, but also like, I came, I started off as like a canvasser, then a campaign manager, then in all
Yeah.
those different roles, I
Yeah.
tended to be, and as I climbed the ladder, especially in those initial years when I walked in, like
Is it
I was the,
difficult?
I never found it as such because my dad always took me to work with him. And so I've always had male friends. I've never seen really that difference. Like
Yeah.
I work that I don't see that difference when I'm in like a professional setting or even my friendship circles. I'm very, I have my girlfriends, but like my overall friends are like a very
Hmm.
big mix. It's not, so I've never seen that as an issue. And I've also been like a
Interesting.
lot of times the youngest, and so I'm also
The
very
youngest of
like in the room,
in the
right?
okay, I hear what you're
So
saying.
it's, and now like sometimes when people were like, well, he's much older, but as since I was 15, I was working with people that are already like
Hmm.
at that time 40, 50 years
Yeah,
old,
yeah. You
right? So
learn to navigate
and but I don't see the
around.
difference, right? Like because I was placed in leadership roles at an early age, so
Hmm.
I think that even that quick decision campaigns are, I used to run campaigns, so
Hmm.
and with campaigns like you don't have time to worry. You don't have
Hmm.
time to like, sit there and dwell on an issue because things happen left and right, and like you have to be
Yeah,
very quick on how you respond to things, right? And so I think that's also trained me in many ways to like,
yeah.
you know,
That's so interesting. I loved how earlier you said my purpose. I'm all about purpose. I think
right,
purpose is pretty essential in a person's life, and we're all here for a
right.
reason. What do you think your purpose is?
I would say, in my own way, leaving a dent, and my city that I call home, it's better than I found it, right? And my purpose really has always been access.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I had to like sum it up, it's not like when we talk about small business support, when we talk about equity issues, when we talk about women, whatever, all of those things for me at the
Mm-hmm.
end of the day are through a lens of an immigrant whose family had language barriers, who continues to have language barriers. It is the story of most families. Over 53% of our residents are immigrants,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I always say that, if I can help create a system where, anybody's mom or dad that doesn't speak English, doesn't know how to navigate, can show up to the counter and get their things done without calling their children, we have created a system that works for all Americans. It's not just for
Mm-hmm.
my community, but that applies across the board for working class families that, you know, don't have the luxury, don't know how systems work. Um, you know, I proud to have initiated the Small Business Summit that now is like, we just had it second year in a row. We had about 500 businesses, small businesses that participated. And I think my happiest moment was walking in and seeing the diversity in that room because all of a sudden it wasn't, I've been going to city events for many, many years. It tends to be the same group of people
Mm.
that are just kind of, and I walked in, there was diversity in age. I saw a lot of young people, young entrepreneurs, young business owners, a lot of cultural diversity, people that had language barriers, but it was also how you market that. right? And how you make it even palatable, where we were making sure that any of the sessions also, if someone needed it, was available to them in Armenian. It was
Yes.
available to them in Tagalog. We have a huge Filipino community, so I know a lot of people were like, "Why? You know, you're always posting stuff with it." You know, it's and for me, the reality is that things that a city council member makes decision on are things that are impacting all of us, and we
Yeah.
we we have a shared issue with the things that concern us. Housing and affordability is huge. I mean, we keep talking about this like we're building affordable housing. We're not building affordable housing. We're building housing. I will give that, but
100%.
affordable housing means that somebody on minimum wage can actually afford to live in
Oh,
those
there's so
units,
many people
right?
moving out.
And so there's, but there's also things like, I'm the only, I guess now mayor, but like on the council that doesn't have a single family home, right? And I think about like my generation and the generations that come, who's going to be able to afford to buy a home in Glendale without
Yeah.
support, without help, right? But when you look at some of these things now, I'm looking at partnering with some other cities to push for a change in the state law, because the reason that condos, for example, are not being built and have not been for like many decades now is because there's a state law that um, puts a liability on the developer for 10 years, that the homeowner up to 10 years can come back and sue them. And so there's been a trend of people at that last minute suing, right? And so developers don't want to build condos anymore. And that is
Wow, yeah.
why a lot of the condo buildings you'll see are
Older, yes.
older buildings,
Versus,
right? And so, but condos are also your starter home. Like that's where you like, if you have the ability to get that, then you have like your first,
transition into.
yes. And things like,
And this is true, yeah. A lot of people tend to lean on.
this is very like controversial on the city council, but um, you know, historic districts are another big thing for me. And I'm all for, you have a historic home. There's an iconic thing that was built last year. It doesn't have to be old, but it can be historic. But these whole concepts of historic districts and not taking input from a larger group of residents.
Yeah.
And I tried to change that. Our current process, if you collect 50% of the signatures from those residents, then you can, bring it. And it's done under these guise of like preserving the beauty of our neighborhoods. We already have codes and stuff that allow for that. But what ends up happening is, and I talk about like, this is when I say like the immigrant or the working class experience, right? I never, so I finally bought a house, and with a lot of working class families, a couple of people have put their life savings into purchasing that property if they were able to, right? But more often than not, they don't have the money to renovate. So they purchase this property,
Yes.
then they're saving because they want to like change their windows at some point. They want to do all these upgrades to their home, but they can't afford it. Then comes in, and without ever having their signature, right? That area is converted into a historic district, which then forces them to comply with not being able to change anything on the house that they bought in hoping to change. And I have cases now where, I mean, my hands are tied, right? Because of the things that are in the books, where somebody, like, it was a young family trying to change their windows. They were anticipating it's going to be about a $10,000 project. It's costing them $80,000 right now because the wood has to be a certain look. And, again, like being mindful of how you're preserving the beauty of your neighborhoods, but also not adding these barriers. Affordable housing isn't just for rent. It's also how do you make home ownership affordable,
Yeah.
right? And so, I mean, there's like
Yeah.
all these
yeah.
things I'm very passionate about.
And
but
I
it's,
love that. And that seems like it's a lot. So how do you manage self-care? What do you do for yourself? What does Mayor Asatryan do for herself?
I
Because you were
love-
talking about getting an hour of sleep.
yes, I'm running on.
pretty
I'm officially
intense.
right now running on 1
Yeah.
hour
So
sleep.
how do you like take care of yourself?
So I feel like it's very natural. It has been that way. I used to be the executive director for ANC, and when I was leaving there, I, jokingly said, And there was definitely truth to that, that I hadn't slept for 11 years.
My
And
sorry for cutting you off, but my old boss would say, "I'll sleep when I'm dead."
right.
It was like
But I
his
also
thing.
I try to like I'm very big on like trying to fit things in. So I'll
Mm.
give you an example. Like even if it's, you know, not this last meeting, but the meeting prior, I think went until like 11, right? And we were in a meeting for 9 hours.
11, like at night.
Yes.
Oh
So
my
a lot of
goodness.
times it'll go until midnight, but we start. People think it starts at 6. We have an afternoon session. I've been trying to like
Mm-hmm.
get people to understand what's on the agenda if they want to call in and whatnot, or
Yeah.
if they don't want to come in, at least call in. But um, so I was in a meeting for 9 hours, and usually before that meeting, we have a whole bunch of other meetings, and then you get a packet that's this big to review on. So on Thursday, the agenda becomes public with all the reports. It's usually a binder this thick.
Oh my lord.
And between Thursday and Tuesday's meeting, you have to go through the whole thing. And then
Mm-hmm.
if you have any questions with staff, you go through the briefings on Mondays. So meetings are on Tuesdays. You usually like start your day very early, and then go into meeting. But even if it's like 11:30 at night, like I'm known for not going home. I will
Oh my god.
go and grab some food with friends or grab a
Yeah, to
drink,
squeeze in that self care
right? Like
time
it's
with.
a,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't also want to get in the habit of that and then neglecting. I think one of the things, I used to be a consultant before I
Oh my
ran, right? Like
gosh.
for
That's why
like
you were
political
asking me. Yeah.
political consulting, right? But I
Yeah.
think one of the saddest things that I have seen over the years is I don't think that the public understands the self-sacrifices
Yes.
that elected officials make
Yeah. I was gonna
in
have you
in
get
in
into
in
that.
public service. But I think the saddest things I've seen is like people lose their family. People that are in elected office lose their family, friends over time.
Is this really
Right?
true?
It is, and I've seen that loneliness in other people. I think over the years, and I'm very conscious. I'm so blessed to have an amazing group, like support system, both in friends and in family. I'm very
Yeah.
close to my family, and my time with them and my nephews is like really, really important to me, and how I try to like squeeze that in.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't want it to be squeezed in. I'm like, you know what?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to be able to make it to this event
You know
because
what's
I don't
interesting?
want to miss the water polo
No,
practice, right? Like
absolutely. For your nephew,
yeah,
because it's a
it's
yeah.
but it's really difficult because the public looks at it as like, I don't think they recognize that there's only one of you and
Mm.
all of them. And Glendale City Council members don't actually. We have two executive assistants that we all share that help with our calendar, but
Mm-hmm.
we're in charge of checking our own emails. Anything you'll see on my social media is me doing it. Um, and obviously, the more active you are, the more requests you get, right? And so I had this conversation with like a colleague when I first got on, where I was like, how are you managing your calendar? Because this is kind of crazy. And each of our experience is very different on the
Right, of
council.
course.
They'll be like, what do you mean? I have like 3, 4 meetings a week. I'm like, I have 10 meetings a day, right? And so the more vocal you are, or then the word gets around like, oh, Elle is like responsive, so I can reach out to her and she can help me navigate this permit thing.
Yeah.
And especially if I'm not somebody that'll just send an email and then sit
Yeah.
knowing that like there needs to be some sort of hand holding through that process, right? Um, but I mean, when I look at some of my dear friends who were elected officials, by the end of their journey, they have no friends left, right? Because they
That's
never,
tough.
like once,
You lose
twice, three. Yeah.
connections. You
And it's like,
do.
sorry, I'm busy. Sorry, I have
You
to be at this
do.
event. Sorry, I have to be at this meeting. Sorry, I have to,
Yeah.
and for me, you know, I'm not 100% perfect, and it's a really difficult struggle. But I'm also mindful. I'm very, very mindful to want to make sure that, and sometimes it requires like sit down conversations with friends
Yeah.
saying, just because I couldn't make it to this thing doesn't mean that I'm not going to try to make it to the other,
Oh,
right?
yes.
Or your friends and family start thinking that you're busy, so they don't turn to you, right? Like they don't want to, they think they're being a burden when they know what your schedule is like.
Yeah.
But those are things that I value and that are important to me, right? And so, like, making sure that I continue to both emotionally and mentally, not just like for good times, but be present in my personal relationships. So
Yeah,
you're being torn in
absolutely.
like,
Oh,
if you are
yes.
mindful of those things,
No,
which I really,
100%.
really am, and I care about those things. I had a friend out in Colorado. uh, I was working um, for some time there. He was a former elected that was running for a different office, and his dog got sick. And I happened to be in Colorado in that time, and he was devastated, and he called saying, "Will you come by?" And I have this image of him in his apartment. This guy was like loved, like he was always surrounded by people, right, during the day. And I walked into his place, and I was surprised that like he called me, right? Like he may be a friend, but I wouldn't in that moment. I don't know if I would have called him, right? Like the relationship
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
And he had this like piece of chicken on the counter that he was like trying to eat, but his dog was sick, and he was like on the verge of like dying, and so it was like a very emotional moment for him. But in that moment, I always have that picture of this person that was like surrounded by so many people during the day, but in his toughest moment,
He was
he
alone.
he was alone, and
Yeah.
like I never want to take my relationships for granted. I don't want to take my friendships for granted, my
Yeah.
family for granted. And I really am lucky in that sense, because I think sometimes, even like being Armenian, right? Like there's an added layer of um, the expectations from family or whatever. And
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
I call my family like a pleasant unicorn in many, many ways,
Yeah.
because my parents not only brought us up in this like love bubble, which has also like set, people a lot of times when people talk about like women's issues and domestic violence and stuff, they'll say like, were you like, te- people that have come through that or are survivors of that tend to be the ones that are very
Mm-hmm.
passionate about that.
Oh, yes.
And my answer has actually been like, no, it's the reverse for me, because like I grew up in this like what I call like perfection of a love bubble, where like there was so much love and mutual respect, and there is to date within my, not just my between my parents, but like my extended family is also like that. And a lot of like equality in those rooms, right? Like everyone's kind of
Yes.
like a partner. So as I was growing up, like for me, there was no difference between like men and women in the sense of like, oh, well, you're a woman, you can't do these things, or, chivalry was always there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always said this, like being feminine, you can be a feminist and feminine at the same time. Like that's not exclusive from one
Mm-hmm.
another. But I think as I was growing up, I think seeing the disparities like in the families of like my friends really like created like a shock factor for me, because
Yeah.
I think I'm constantly operating out of a place of shock. It's not like the personal experience for me, and I want to say like I'm also blessed that none of my personal relationships have ever brought me to a point where like I have felt that in any shape or form on my
Yeah.
own.
But it
But
still it still does. You still sacrifice a lot, don't you?
oh, absolutely. I mean, with respect to personal life, oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean,
What
there's
do you think you've sacrificed?
well,
Or
I would say definitely being on elected. The system that we have in Glendale uh, is really skewed towards people that are retired and who are wealthy. So I would definitely say, as somebody who's in their early 40s, I basically committed financial suicide personally to do this. We get paid, I think, like $1,400 a month. Um, and
what?
yes, and I had no plans to run for office. I got pissed off during COVID at a thriving consulting firm, and um, I got into an argument with one of the current council members
Oh
about a
my God.
program.
You just dropped a
And
bomb.
yeah, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna run. And a lot of my political friends were like, "What are you doing?" Because usually, people run for office, they get they serve, and then they go open up a consulting firm because they make the contacts throughout. But I already had
Yeah.
the contacts. I had a thriving consulting firm, and my reputation is everything to me. So actually, like, I didn't want there to be a perception that I'm like somehow, like, I even canceled contracts that I had. So I've literally been living off of my savings in the last year and a half, and like committing financial suicide by being in this position. And that is why historically, when you look at the Glendale City Council members that have served, they've either been older and retired, or wealthy, or they have a second income at home, which allows for them to basically do this. And if you do this right, it's more than a full time job. They, you can choose to be, and I have colleagues that they show up on Tuesdays, they vote, and then maybe you'll see them at a few events here and there. But if you actually want to make meaningful change, and you want to work on policy and whatnot, it's more than a full time job. And
Yeah.
you want, so
Absolutely. And the financial piece, that's definitely a big
mean,
one that you just said, but also personally,
no,
like as a human being, you make such personal sacrifices.
I don't see them as sacrifice. I think it's just ingrained
Really?
in me. No, I love what I do. Um, I see it as a privilege and an honor to
Yeah.
serve. And again, like, depends on what you're driven by, right? And what you want. And sometimes when like people will show me like the awful comments that like, like people have left, I think that's the hardest part, where especially in this day and age with social media, um, anybody can like post anything without it being fact checked or accurate. And I've had this running joke for a while. I'm like, every morning I wake up, I'm like, what did I do today that I didn't know I did?
I think
So,
that's all of us.
right? Like, I mean, even with like taxes and stuff, I was adamantly against taxes, any new taxes, increase in any taxes. I brought up the fact that there's inflation right now. I was actually the only one that voted against fee increases, saying like, this is not how we do it. And then the morning after, I'm seeing like on social media, like some groups are posting like, I increased taxes. I'm like, no, I didn't. Like, not only not did I not, but I actually like helped like halt the whole thing, right? And so,
Yeah.
and because we don't have staff support, like I don't have time to like put together,
I hear you.
and it also has to be like, I can't just hand it off to a volunteer. So yes, I have some like people that support me and that volunteer to help with certain things, but they're like just supporters. They're not they're not my staff.
What do you need?
I think it would be helpful for people to, I think not just for me, I think just in general, right? My first call would be to like not believe everything that you see on social media, right? But also be active in your local government. I think the greatest help I can get with any of these things that I'm talking about is people to stop talking around dinner tables and around drinks. And you don't even, the system has been in place as such that you don't even have to come into the council chambers. You can call
Yeah.
in from that restaurant or wherever you're at, or you can't leave, right? But really follow the agendas, follow your council decisions, because they're impacting every part of your life on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you,
Yeah.
some of the greatest initiatives I've had have come from constituents,
Mm.
right? They're like, oh, it would be a great idea if, and I'm like, oh, let's check on that, and so,
You know what's really
right?
funny? The grandmas.
Oh, yes.
They give you a whooping. And I
Well,
just
so
love how
here's-
you answer it though. You're like, and
So what
you're
people
like,
don't know, what people
so
don't
cute.
know,
But
don't,
these I
no, no,
admire
no. But
them.
what people don't know, and that's the caveat here, because they're seeing the snippet of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thinking Tamara and I talk on daily basis,
Yes.
if not like on a weekly
There's
basis.
a relationship
right?
there.
So when I call her Tati, I'm not being rude,
Yeah.
because for me she's just like my grandma,
Yeah.
right? But I also I mean, so she actually, like, for example, came yesterday to the council meeting, and then I think it was like a week and a half ago, she called and left me a voicemail about there's a tree that is like tilting over, and then there's some like news box that has like trash over it. And so I literally had Public Works go out and take a look at the tree, and then, she's somebody that's very active,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
so, so I see her. So she had come about another thing that like at the council meeting. And so after the council meeting, what people didn't see is my interaction with her after the
Yeah.
council meeting or before, or the call that she made, or how I sent staff,
Yeah.
right?
I
And
have to agree with you on that.
it's those snippets,
It
right?
is. I think we get that backhand a lot as human beings. Like we don't get to see the full picture. There's
Right.
these snippets and then you're just
And
glorified.
number one, I'm not gonna take my it's council time. We're making like business decisions
Of
for our city,
course.
right? So if I started addressing all of these things, then we're never gonna get through that agenda, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm not here. And again, when I say like when you know what you're doing on a daily basis,
Mhm.
everything else becomes really noise,
Yeah.
right? And so I don't. So no, I'm actually like if there is hate on certain issues, it actually empowers me. I don't. It doesn't. It doesn't. I actually have an adverse reaction to that because
How
I'm
did you
like,
get to that level?
I've always just been like that. I don't think it kind of grew over time. I've always just been like, my parents raised me to be thoughtful and kind and making sure that I'm like somebody that is respectful of everybody. And for
Mhm.
me, that's really, really important in the sense that um, I can't just, I think it's, especially as an Armenian elected official, right? There's this kind of like double standard where our community is looking at me from one view or something that they saw, which is not even true, right? Um, and then what they're not seeing is that other 60% of the city that I represent, right? And so being somebody that's accessible to all. If I'm talking about access, my beginnings were because my community didn't have access,
Yeah.
right? Like they weren't hiring Armenians in City Hall. We had to make policy changes when Rafi Manukian was there. We had to create sensitivity training programs for the Glendale Police Department. I was working on those things. I created a police complaint hotline that helped identify the officers that were like targeting Armenians, like especially the community that either wasn't um, involved back then, or the immigrant communities that have come in the last 10 years, they haven't seen that changed. What they've come into is a police department that's extremely welcoming and very community
Mhm.
oriented, and you get to see Vahe
They
and
don't get to see the
right,
backstage of
right,
what it took.
right.
Yeah.
And so for me, like when we talk about equity, I always say that I never want anyone to feel that they are not welcomed in the city. This is everyone's city.
But
So my job as a leader is
mhm.
to make sure that all of my residents are safe, that all of my residents feel like this is their home.
Absolutely. And what do you think about the other portion of people that don't feel so safe though, with all the changes that are happening in schools and this equality that you're talking about?
Mhm.
I mean, do you feel like those people also deserve to feel safe, like all those parents
So
deserve to feel safe?
I will say this. Um, I think a lot of folks don't know this. The city council makes zero decisions when it comes to schools. Let's start there.
Yeah.
So there's the school district is completely ran by the state of California, right? But I will say, as an example, and this is
Yeah.
not something that you saw when those protests were happening. This is America. This is where you get to protest, but
Mhm.
you get to do it in a civil way,
Yeah, peaceful.
right?
Mhm.
And so even during my remarks during that time at the council, my direction and my comments were that I don't care what side this is, and I don't think this issue is even two-sided. I think it's very layered. Uh, Everyone has to feel safe to be able to make their voice heard in a manner that is civil and respectful to
Right.
others, right?
Right.
And so, but those are not the comments you'll ever see on some of those platforms. And you also have to look at who's behind those platforms
Mm.
and what purpose are they serving, right? And I'll even give you an example on specifically, like, you know that I ran for state assembly, and that was not part of the plan. And the main reason that I did it is, and I kept waiting, and I got in very late. I kept waiting to see if there's another Armenian that's going to jump in the race, because we don't have a single Armenian in the California legislature, and that's just absolutely unacceptable to me.
Why do you think
But
that is?
but what ended up happening, if I may
No,
like finish
please,
that, but
please.
the groups that were constantly posting, oh, she's this or she's that or whatnot during my state assembly race, they didn't even know who my opponents are, right? And then when the race finished, they were like, wait, who's Nick that won, right? Or who's this like 20 person that was in the race, or who's, and so, there is something to sometimes, I think about, the elected officials that aren't so public, right? The ones that don't have social media. I mean,
Mm.
I have four other colleagues. How many of them are as active, right? Like, and the more active you are, the bigger target you become, because people recognize your name.
Yes,
They recognize,
yes.
and for me, like, even when I was running for city council, there would be folks that were absolutely attacking me without knowing who I'm running against, what I stand for, what they stand for. By all means, I think that's the beauty. I've always loved campaigns for that reason. And my beginnings were registering Armenian Americans to vote, for them to actually have a voice at the ballot box. And I would say my biggest mentor throughout these years is Rafi Manukyan, whose campaign inspired me to get involved, right? And so, and I still turn to him. Like, I would definitely say that he's like my one and only, like, true, like, I will turn to him when it comes to policy decision making, or
Mm-hmm.
when I'm trying to like figure things out, where struggling with like a certain decision, right? Or how I bring consensus around an issue. But um, it's interesting to me that the people are so wanting to put you in a box,
Yeah.
right? And when they can't put you in a box, I think that's where the struggle is. And some of the jokes for me is like, some of those comments would be like, "Oh my God, her hair's so short. It gets on my nerves." Or like, I think some of the things I've seen, like, the shorter her hair, the crazier she gets. Or what are these Converse she's wearing? Or I hate her lipstick color. Or like, change your lipstick color. I'm like, may my hair, my Converse, and my lipstick be the biggest problem in your life. Because if those are the issues, and those are the things that, like, you
Yeah.
never hear, like, I think women are judged differently, right? And I actually, if you kind of go back, for many years, I actually wouldn't. I always wore suit dresses because I didn't even want to
By
think
the way, we're
about.
dressed so
Oh yeah,
alike today. I was looking, I'm like, what? Now people are
right.
gonna think this is like
No,
arranged.
yeah, no, but I literally wouldn't even want to like spend time on picking a top for the
It's so
suit,
convenient.
right? So
It's
I would just do a suit dress and call it a day. Because, and there's been, even like at City Hall, because I tend to be like more put together. And I remember the first time, like, I was only going to meet with staff about something, and I showed up with, like, my hair. I hadn't like fixed my hair, and staff's not like used to seeing me that way. And like, "Are you okay?" And just kind of looked, and I was like, "I chose to spend as much time on my hair as my male colleagues today. Let's get to business." Like,
yeah.
it's not, I mean, I'm not in a public setting, right? I'm meeting with my team. And I think about those things as a woman, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think I have perfected. I actually think I should do a video on, like, I can go from a hike to a gala in 30 minutes, like, take a shower, go get my
Yeah.
hair,
You
like,
start learning to
like
manage your time
how
like that.
you get ready so quickly. But even if it's that 30 minutes or
Yeah.
whatever it's going to take, many times I'll be like, but this is not what my colleagues are spending their time on, right? Like, you're putting makeup on, you're fixing your hair, those are all like added things
I
that
hear you.
how do you remain presentable and make sure that
Yeah.
that's there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's also how people view you, and women are judged differently, um, and so figuring out like clever ways to get around that, and um, you know how you're making like you're doing one thing while the other one's trying, and so
Yeah. Yeah.
and
It's
rushing
really
out
tough.
the door, right? So, but
What would you want people to know about you that they don't know on a personal level? Well, not too personal, but maybe something about like your life, your likes, your goals, your dreams, besides
I'm
of
absolutely
work.
sarcastic and ridiculous in my
Really?
personal life.
Like you're funny.
Uh, I want to say it's like dry humor.
Ooh,
Humor.
dark
Yeah, yeah,
humor.
yeah.
My son's
It's
got
like
that.
so.
It's hilarious.
And I'm very light in my personal life, and I think it has always also had to do with that like balance, because I think my work has always been so just heavy in decision making, where
Oh
in my
yeah.
personal life I'm just literally like, the joke would be even like with friends, like just tell me the time to show up at the
Yeah, I
restaurant, and
understand
I'll
that.
I'll be there,
Yeah.
right? Or I remember we were planning a girls trip for one of my friends' birthdays a couple of years ago, and I do these like things where like there's a whole text thread happening and I'm not looking at it, but I know that it's at 7, so at 6:50, like I'll pop in and be like, there's no way I'm reading that whole thing, so I'll be like, where are we meeting? But
I hear
we were
you.
going on a trip, and one of my friends who's very like, she's the planner. She was like, well, I need to know who wants to do what, and like, but I said, look, I only care that I open my eyes and I see the ocean and
Mhm.
I can walk to the
Oh
thing.
yeah.
Everything else, like, I'm fair game. But I think people forget that sometimes elected officials are human and personal, and I get that a lot too, because I'll try to post some like personal stuff, right? And I, I think just even growing up, people are so used to seeing their elected officials be so serious, right? Like, because it's this been this stiff, um,
Yeah.
and I think if you are if you're a public servant, and a lot of the comments, even on like as mayor, like I'll get back saying like, or as a council member, be like, oh, you're more approachable. You're like, I'm like, if you're a public servant, you're a public servant. You're one of the people. I'm not above you. I'm your servant. Like, and that concept, I've always cared about impact and not titles, right? And so if you're coming from that place, then I think everything else just kind of falls into place.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's
What would you be doing if you weren't the mayor of Glendale? Like if you
I
weren't
would
into
be.
politics.
Oh, I think we're one and the same. I
Yeah.
don't, yeah, no, I would,
This is
I mean,
yours.
I loved my political consulting. I'm really proud to say that um, I not only did not, I never seeked a client when I opened it. It just took off on its own.
Yeah.
And I never took on clients I didn't believe in. I worked on causes that I really, really cared about on the state and federal level, and helping other people get elected, and advocacy efforts, and so and nonprofit. So it was like the firm had like really three wings, which was nonprofit development, political advocacy, and political campaigns. It's all the stuff that
Yeah.
I loved and knew how to
Yeah.
do, and um, and again, like that's why I say like titles are not right? Like you could, there's so many different ways you can make an impact. And when I had my consulting firm, I still was always available to my community. I never, every time I would go and fight the city over permits or whatnot, they weren't my clients, and I had because I had a consulting firm, I
Yeah.
would have to state this. I'm not their consultant on this. I'm not being paid. I'm like,
Yeah.
but it would drive me crazy that somebody wouldn't be able to like navigate the system, and especially when it came to Glendale and my community, I was very like, I would be in Colorado and something would happen in Glendale, and then I would like volunteer to like
Yeah.
put some
Yeah.
action alert together around that. So I think it's always just been part of me. Like I don't,
Yeah.
I can't imagine
I
it.
could understand that. I understand that.
Yeah, it's not.
You're like,
So
what? You don't
sometimes I'm
You're
like, no, sometimes I'm like, I'm gonna move to the mountains. You know, I love being in the mountains, and I'm like, I'm
Oh,
gonna move to
yeah.
the mountains, make jam. I'm like, I will probably last 2 weeks, like, and then I'm like, okay, what's next?
We're
Like,
so not used to it, though. I
right?
love that lifestyle too, like the nature,
Yeah.
just away from all the noise, away from Glen Oaks.
Well, I mean, that's my self-care, and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
will say
for
that.
sure.
So, if I am gonna block off an hour or two, and a ridiculous thing about my car, like I'm always ready for the beach or a hike or
Yes.
whatnot. So, and when we say like squeeze in, like I may be like, I can't really just try to do it nowadays, but not really. But I used to like, if I had an hour or two in between a meeting and say like I was in Orange County and then I was going to come back to LA, definitely if I had an hour or two in between, you would find me at the beach at those
Oh
2
my
hours,
gosh, you're a
right?
water person like
So
me.
it's not like, but that's like what you do with your time. I'm not
Yeah.
a couch person.
No.
I can't sit and watch TV.
That's exactly.
I will leave at night and drive to the beach at night
Mhm.
and hang out at the beach.
The sound of the
Yeah.
water, it's so healing.
Right.
I think that some women and men too in general don't the understanding of self-care, it's I think backwards. Oh, it's okay. Backwards.
Right.
Because most people think it's about like outside care, like like getting your hair done,
Yeah.
but I think it's so much deeper than that. I think self-care is all about just the silence, just to yourself.
Right.
Maybe like the water or like the mountains or doing something much deeper than that.
Right.
So I love hearing people
I love
actually say,
I love traveling on my own.
Yeah.
Also, and I love time on my own. And
Yes.
I think especially now, even like I was having a conversation with someone at the Vartavar event. 'Cause
You
I
went
think
to that event?
Oh, I love.
You
Oh my
did?
God, are you kidding
I
me?
love
Yeah,
Vartavar, but I'm
yeah.
always so like scared to go because it's a lot.
Well, I mean
It's a lot.
okay, so that's my personality.
Yeah.
That is my like I will.
You're like
and
extroverted.
And well, I also, I'm very activity oriented.
Yeah, that's
So
awesome.
it's the skiing and the ice skating.
That's amazing.
So I can't just like sit still. But yeah, someone was like, I think they were just seeing that like a lot of people were approaching, and I was just kind of being
Yeah.
pulled.
Yeah,
And they're like, how do you do this all day? Like, I'm like, honestly, like sometimes I think especially after COVID, I used to be able to do it like and not be tired. And I think having been like even operating in small circles during COVID, I get overstimulated now where it's like one event after another. And these
Oh
are the
my
things,
gosh,
right?
yes.
I just like when I get home, I'm like, okay,
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to. And that's why, like, for me, those like close relationships where,
Yeah.
I had sent like a meme to two of my girlfriends the other day because we're like a triangle. And I was like, I love hanging out in threes because, like, the conversation can go on without me. And I can be like, ooh, tree, cute. So,
Yeah, I hear
like,
you.
it's, being able to be in that space where
Of course.
you're comfortable and you're just, also being able to be in silent
Yes.
space.
Just
in your own-
yourself, like
Yeah.
you and yourself.
Yeah.
A lot of people are so scared to be in their bodies nowadays, and that's so unfortunate because it's such a beautiful place to be
Yep.
if we can genuinely just be
Right.
comfortable in
Right.
ourselves. Well, Mayor Asatryan, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure, and I
Pleasure
had
was
fun.
mine.
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. It was such a good conversation, and I'm happy that you came. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
All right.